As a personality and social psychologist, I'm more interested in it as a trait, which basically means that there's this continuum and everybody falls somewhere on a continuum of narcissism. So basically what I'm saying is that people, personality and social psychologists, looked at what narcissism is from a clinical lens and started to understand that there's these subclinical manifestations, and to some extent, narcissism exists in all of us.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
Joining me today is Amy Brunell, professor of social psychology at Ohio State's Mansfield campus, where she joins me today via Zoom. Her primary line of research concerns the role of narcissism in social contexts. She has published papers about the role of narcissism in predicting emergent leadership, greed, academic cheating, decision-making, and relationship behaviors. In 2023, she won the Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching. Dr. Brunell, welcome to Voices.
Thank you for having me.
I introduce you as someone who studies narcissism, and we're going to do a deep dive into this, but I wonder if you begin first with a definition. What is the clinical definition of narcissism?
Okay, I'll start with the clinical definition and then I'll talk about the social psychology personality lens. Okay, so in terms of the history of narcissism, it was first a diagnosis. It still is a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder. And you need a clinician, a licensed clinician, to get a diagnosis. And it's something that interferes with daily living. It affects about 6% of the general population. As a personality and social psychologist, I'm more interested in it as a trait, which basically means that there's this continuum and everybody falls somewhere on a continuum of narcissism. So basically what I'm saying is that people, personality and social psychologists, looked at what narcissism is from a clinical lens and started to understand that there's these subclinical manifestations, and to some extent, narcissism exists in all of us.
All of us. So I want to make certain I was clear about this. So you're suggesting, for instance, that I have elements of this trait in me.
Yes. I mean, basically, when we call people narcissists in my field, we're just talking about people who are on the higher end, right? So, I would probably refer to somebody who is not very narcissistic as a low narcissist or even a non-narcissist, but they still have a score on our continuum.
How does this trait sort of manifest itself? Let's say the people at the high end. At what stage do we identify someone as narcissistic?
So basically, the research that we do compares people who are higher versus lower on the continuum. And so there's no real cutoff. We're just referring to narcissists as, this higher end in this research, just for simplicity, per brevity. So there are three sort of flavors of narcissism, right, that exists, at least that we know about today, at an individual level. So I would say that there's two forms of grandiose narcissism, one which we call agentic grandiose narcissism, and the other that we call communal grandiose narcissism, and then a third one which we call vulnerable narcissism. So starting with grandiose narcissism, we have two forms, and the difference between them tend to be that one is involving self-enhancement in an agentic domain, intelligence, dominance, and the other is self-enhancing in a communal domain. They're helpful, they're, bringing peace to the world, everyone's best friend. And then you have the vulnerable narcissists who seem really different because they tend to have lower self-esteem. They tend to be more defensive, more hostile and manipulative. And so they seem like they're really different, like maybe they're not even narcissistic at all. And the reason that they are bridged together is because there's three traits that they have in common. So narcissists in general, they are self-centered, they lack empathy for other people, and they are entitled. They feel like they should be getting, more than other people or more than they're actually getting. That's basically what ties the three of them together.
I was really a little surprised, to be honest, that you described a helpful narcissist
Yes.
Who is this person, especially if a narcissist is self-centered and entitled? Who is a helpful narcissist?
I mean, I like to joke with my colleagues that it's the most helpful professor, in a department, the person who's doing the most service. No one is doing as much service as me. So that's my joke with my colleagues. But a lot of people, they're doing good work, but the reason that they're doing it is, for attention or for power and those kinds of things. So they'll endorse things like, I'm going to be the best parent, ever, or I'm going to bring peace to the world. So the measure of communal narcissism is a positive lens, but the more we dig into it, the more we see, that element of entitlement, of power coming out. So it doesn't really seem to be truly selfless.
Hmm. And you've published quite a lot on narcissism, but most recently you've published a book called Understanding and Coping in Social Relationships with Narcissists. And I wonder if you tell us what your findings were, what your argument was in this book.
Sure. So basically, I looked at different kinds of relationships, some in the workplace and some more personal relationships and the dynamics. I mean, if narcissists are narcissists, they just, appear a little bit differently in these different kinds of relationships. So most of the research is on the agentic form of grandiose narcissism. And so in the workplace, they make our lives miserable. They are power seeking. They want all the attention. I mean, they can be pretty hostile and negative. They engage in incivility and basically what we call counterproductive workplace behaviors, which is basically it can be something like white collar crime, but it can also just be things like bullying, setting up other people to fail, hoarding resources to yourself. I mean, those kinds of things can be really tricky, especially if this person is the boss. In terms of more personal relationships, I mean, they're everywhere. They're your neighbors, they're your friends, they're your romantic partners. And a lot of times people aren't aware that they are interacting with the narcissist because the narcissist, especially when you first meet them, they're likable and they're charming. So they kind of pull us in. And then over time, you get to see more of the negative dynamics, especially in romantic relationships. They cheat, they play games with their partner's emotions, they induce jealousy to make sure they have power in their relationships. And so we see all these patterns. And one of the foci of my book was that there isn't a whole lot of research to tell us how to cope or how to deal with it. And I would say it's the question that I get the most often. If a layperson is contacting me, they're asking me what they can do. There isn't a lot of systematic research, and there's still not a lot of systematic research on what can be done. A lot of the work out there, I think it's really good suggestions. It's usually by counselors who are trying to help people navigate around these relationships. So I'm not a counselor.
That
So
was my next question.
yeah,
Are you a counselor?
I am not a counselor. I'm a researcher. And so I recommend that they find a really good counselor. If it's a couple, I might suggest that they find, a couples counselor. But if nothing else, they find a counselor to help them with their own coping. One of the difficulties for narcissistic relationships is that the narcissist feels great about themselves. So they think everyone else is the problem. So there's some difficulties in terms of marital relationships, for example, of getting a narcissist to get therapy, probably more likely to go as a couple where they can, tell the therapist that the spouse is the problem. But I think it's really hard to get a narcissistic person in the door to begin with. It's typically when they're having other kinds of problems that they'll seek out help themselves, but they still don't really get that they are the problem. It'll be things like issues that they're having at the workplace or issues that they're having in their marriage or, their children aren't talking to them and they don't quite understand what's happening. And that typically is what will get them into counseling if they go at all.
Are there typically other problems associated with narcissists? I mean, is there any sort of pattern there?
So, I mean, in terms of interpersonal, like the close relationships, I would say yes, because they are not good romantic partners. I mean, so when you're first getting involved, they seem great because they're fun and they're charming, right? And then over time, they lose their appeal because their more negative qualities are coming out. They're selfish. They're self-serving. Everything is all about them. They think they're better than everyone else. They treat their partners like they're trophies. And I would say a lot of people realize that they're in this kind of relationship when it's already too late. They're already married, for example. And not that you can't get out of a relationship, but it's not quite so easy at that point. So just telling people to leave seems too simplistic. So, I mean, one of the patterns that is found in ongoing relationships with narcissists are things like hostile communication, especially if there's conflict. They're just really nasty and negative to their partners. And so relationships can go from bad to worse because of things like that.
How would you describe your research process in coming to this? Are you bringing people into your lab? Tell us your research process.
So, a lot of what I did in my book was talk about other people's research, and they did bring couples into the lab. Relationships research is really fascinating. They have either audio or video of couples that are engaging in natural conversations, and then they have coders that code the relationships for things that they're looking for. So, I have done this kind of process myself, but not in terms of looking at narcissism. So for, example, I might want to know how intimate a couple is when they're communicating. So I can look for, nonverbal signs of affection. I can look at, are you getting clarity on a misunderstanding? Or are you just hostile and nasty? Are you withdrawing and shutting down? So those are the kinds of things that researchers will be looking at. And we can detect narcissism pretty easily. I think we don't give ourselves enough credit. For example, one of my studies, we just had transcripts and we were studying narcissism, but something else altogether. And I asked research assistants to read through people's answers to an interview and to rate how narcissistic they thought these people were. And there was some relative accuracy in terms of the scores that they gave me, the participant gave me in the research, and how narcissistic my research assistants thought they were. And there's other studies, that you just watch a really brief clip of the person talking and you can say that person seems a little bit more narcissistic. So we are better at detecting it than we think. I think sometimes we just don't trust our judgments.
Why do you suppose that is?
I think because we want to see the good in people. We're terrible, for example, at realizing when people are lying. And one of the arguments for that is that we're motivated to believe that others are telling us the truth. So I just think that that's part of the process. If you are in love with somebody, you want to see the good and not necessarily focus on the bad.
So I introduced you as a professor of social psychology, and
Correct.
presumably that is a different discipline, or at least uses a different methodological orientation than psychology. Could you tell us what are the differences? Or maybe there are no differences.
Well, so I don't have any training in counseling or clinical psychology at all. I don't give therapy. I'm not motivated to give therapy. I am a basic researcher. So I enjoy studying the processes, understanding how narcissists think or how they say they behave or how others say that they behave, more than I want to be in an office trying to give therapy. That was something that I decided back in college not to pursue that route for me. Although, kudos to people who give therapy. It takes really strong, special people to be able to help people solve their own problems. And I just don't think that I have that skill set myself. So I did not see myself as a potential good therapist, although it was what got me in psychology to begin with. I think 18-year-old Amy thought she could be a therapist, and then 22-year-old Amy did not.
So, and I don't know if this has been determined by you or by any other researcher, but is there any sense of the percentage, say, of the American population that's identified as narcissistic? Just to give us a sense of how big this trait is across our population.
Well, I think that's hard to do because, as I said, everyone has a score somewhere, right? So I guess I would say that everybody has an element of narcissism. It is possible to score really low on these questionnaires, but it's not quite like clinical psychology where you have to meet a threshold and then you get a diagnosis. So everybody just has, some level of narcissism, and we're comparing people who are higher versus people who are lower on their patterns of behavior.
You had said earlier that there's a sparse amount of research that addresses how to cope with narcissistic relationships. What explains that? What explains this paucity of research?
I think it's just incredibly difficult to do in a systematic way to know if some kind of manipulation that I don't mean to say like manipulative, but some kind of intervention that is introduced, if it's being used systematically. I think that it's messy research. So I think that that's one of the reasons. There is some research that has potential where they teach different kinds of strategies, either to the person who is narcissistic or to their partners or perhaps both. And they're both, all of them that I can tell are designed to get people to increase their empathy, to take perspective, be reassured that they're loved. And those seem to have some positive effects in terms of things like commitment and how people feel in their relationships. The problem is that we simply don't know how long those kinds of manipulations last. So I suspect that they would need to be repeated over time in order for there to be a real change. Otherwise, you don't know, if something puts you in a bad mood, how long does that bad mood last? Some people it can last for days or weeks, but other people, by the time they're home, they're over it. And I simply don't know how long those interventions last.
Do you think these are questions that will or that can eventually be answered, or do you find these intractable? I mean, are there just some questions we're not going to be able to answer?
I'm hopeful that with more time and more research, perhaps more collaborations, that these kinds of questions can be answered. At the same time, sometimes it's complicated. One of the studies that I talk about in my paper is about a study on coaches. So there are coaches who are recruited, life coaches, like more mentoring.
Right.
So they're working with business executives, right? And these business executives are getting coaching because of issues they're having in the workplace or their communication styles and patterns. And so the participants in the study were the coaches themselves and how they were dealing with their narcissistic client. And it was really interesting to me because what you find in the paper is what worked for one coach didn't work for the other. And then basically the theme was, how do I cope when I have a client who's narcissistic, rather than things that, where they were able to detect as things that were effective with their clients.
Tell us about your lab.
So typically I work with undergraduate students, a lot of times at this point one-on-one, and we develop studies together. A lot of my data collection, not all of it, but a lot of it is done online, sometimes with intro psychology participants, but a lot more with different platforms that we can use. Qualtrics, for example, or Prolific, or even Mechanical Turk through Amazon. And so when we do that, it's basically because we want an older, more diverse sample than what you would get, with 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds in a classroom. And so my students very frequently will either jump onto an idea I already have or even come to me with their own ideas that we develop together into a project. So my students get to see projects all the way through, from, development all the way through data collection and analysis, and then writing or presenting their work.
Are they co-authors on your papers?
They are, yes.
How does an undergraduate end up in your lab? What's that process like? Who's lucky enough to be in your lab?
I would say I get to meet my students, and if they're interested in the work that I'm doing or even the class that I'm teaching, then a lot of them will approach me to ask me about working on research. If somebody is shyer, but they really stand out to me, then I will approach them. And then I think that they're also encouraged by academic advisors, for example, to have some experiences. So I have been really lucky. I've had really great experiences working with my undergrads, but they are like graduate students in my lab because I don't work with graduate students. So, they are, on the one hand, pushed really hard. And then on the other, I'm really patient because they're undergraduate students. They're not, they don't have advanced statistics, for example. So I don't expect that they're going to do complicated analysis for my research.
Students, undergraduate students in your lab, what do they tend to do after they leave, after they graduate? Do you track that? Do you know what the alums lab end up doing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of students, I think that this was hard for some people to hear, but most undergraduates in psychology do not go on for advanced degrees. So they go into the workplace, and I'm very happy for them when they do. And a lot will go on in counseling or go for an MSW. But I've also had students.
Masters of Social Work, I think, right?
Yes, yes, Masters of Social Work. And then others have gone on in counseling or clinical psychology. I've had students go on for PhDs in social psychology. And I've also had students go to medical school and law school.
Hmm. Well, since we're talking about students, I noted when I was introducing you that you're an award-winning teacher. And I wonder if I could pick your brain a bit. So what's your secret? What's your secret to being such an effective teacher?
Okay, my secret. Well, when you work for a regional campus, it's a small place. It means that my classrooms are small. For example, the class I'm teaching now, I want to say there's 13 or 14 students. It means that I get to know the students really well. I know their names, I learn a little bit about them. And I would say that that allows me to have really great conversations with them in the class. I try to keep my students really active in the classroom. So working on projects together or puzzles or having a discussion. And I guess the other thing I would say, what I've heard students say about me, one is that I speak their language, and that probably helps that I'm a mom of kids about their age, but I speak their language. So I'm able to take complicated material and make it user friendly. So that's one thing I've heard about myself. And then the other is that I do spend a lot of time with my undergraduates, whether they're in my lab or they're not. I would say a lot of time specifically with people in my lab, but I know that students have commented that I am willing to, meet with them one on one. They've commented on my accessibility and that it's not hard to come to me for help.
The class, Psychology 4998. I know you work a lot with students there. Is that the way that students get credit for working in your lab?
Yeah, so there's three different ways I would say students have been involved in research. One is through 4998, the course that you refer to, or they do a thesis class, which is Psychology 4999. So they do that. Some volunteer. And in the past, we've also had opportunities for students to get paid. But it seems to work the best for our students to take it for course credit because they can do one credit at a time for 3 semesters, for example, and then have an upper level elective accomplished while they're also, working on publishing papers and doing presentations.
You had earlier mentioned 18-year-old Amy.
Yes.
And I wanted to go back to that and want to ask the question, so why social psychology? Why are you a social psychologist as opposed to something else, as opposed to, I don't know, a physicist or a basketball player or something like that? Did 18-year-old Amy know from the time she was a child that she was going to study psychology?
So I would say yes. I wouldn't say that 6-year-old Amy knew what psychology was, but I knew in high school that I wanted to study psychology. I don't entirely know why, but I think I was really grabbing onto doing therapy. I remember wanting to do therapy with children. I don't think I realized just how hard and complicated that is at the time. And then I got into my major, I was much more engaged in research, like the research classes, statistics, research methods, than I expected to be. I did enjoy my classes on counseling and clinical psychology, but they didn't actually grab me the way that other classes did. I was really drawn into the social psychology classes. When I was asked to come up with research ideas, including an honors thesis, I was drawn into social psychology as the topic. And so, one of the nice things about where I am today is my area of narcissism sort of bridges social psychology and clinical psychology in ways that make me feel fulfilled with what I'm doing. Plus, I do get to, help people, I suppose, by being a professor.
So, of all the problems to study in social psychology, why did you settle upon narcissism?
Yeah, so I really wanted to study relationships. That was where I ended up when I went into graduate school. I went first for a master's degree and I wanted to study relationships. So earlier referred to, filming couples having conversations, and I was doing that in my master's level work. When I was going then on, I had a terminal master's degree and I went on for a PhD. And the lab I joined because they studied relationships, but there was a lot of investigations about self-esteem and narcissism in relationships. If you are around enough with people who are talking about narcissism, you see it everywhere. And all of these questions that come to mind if you're a psychologist is, how does that relate to narcissism? What would a narcissist do? And so the next thing I know, I became a narcissism researcher. It wasn't quite the original plan, but here I am, 20 years, more than 20 years later, studying it.
Please tell us what's next for your research.
Sure. So one of the projects that I'm working on with a student is about how people define narcissism themselves. So when I first started studying narcissism, people didn't really know what it was. I'm not sure that they know what it is now, but they're using the term a lot more. So you hear people calling each other narcissists, and I want to know, what do they mean? Because as we've already talked about, it's pretty complicated. It's a complex set of traits and also an official diagnosis. So if I'm like talking with you casually and I call you a narcissist, what do I mean? So I looked into the literature, and there really is no literature explaining what a stereotype of a narcissist is. I do think that they exist, but I want people to tell me what they're thinking when they see or hear the word narcissist. So that's one of my directions. And then others is building on work that I've been doing. I've done a lot of work with a colleague, Melissa Bulow, on decision making. And so one of the things that we have found, for example, is that narcissists self-report that they engage in a lot of risk. They do a lot of risky behaviors. But if you put them into these situations where you can assess their risk in terms of their actual behaviors, they actually don't behave in more risky ways or only slightly more risky ways than everybody else. So I really like finding those places where their self-report does not necessarily match their behavior.
How do you capture that? In this instance in particular, risky behavior? Are you going to put the subjects in some sort of risky situation? I assume you're not going to do that, but
Well, yeah, I mean, not anything that would be physically harmful, but for example, we can put them in a gambling situation, right? And then see how they perform in those kinds of situations, like how much are they willing to risk, things like that. And there's a series of tasks that are known in the field that assesses different kinds of risk. And those are the tasks where I'm saying that they are slightly more, risky, but not really that much. So they definitely report that they're riskier than they actually are, at least on those tasks. Maybe on other tasks, we would see higher behaviors.
and you're interested in how people sort of self-define narcissism. How are you going to capture that? Is that another sort of survey? Is that another, using some sort of online form? How are you going to determine that?
My first step is to ask them what they're thinking. Simple
So
as
how do you
that.
identify these folks? I mean, they're obviously not going to come to your lab. How do you identify enough people, I suppose, to get a high enough N?
Sure, yeah. So I will put it on a platform that pays people a small amount of money for their participation. It's actually not that hard to get people to participate in that forum. And my study is also not going to be that long. I mean, right now I estimate what I have put together would take 10 minutes. So I think we won't have trouble getting people to participate. And then we'll take their responses and we'll have to code them.
Amy Brunell, thank you.
Thank you.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at the Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.